So far on my channel, we've looked at the first 6 Psalms, and so now we arrive at Psalm 7. And partially because of some of the things I've been doing in the Chronicles series, I want to use Psalm 7 as kind of an excuse to talk about some items of interest. So I'm not going to hit everything in this psalm because that would turn into a 1-hour video, which I feel like is overkill. But we'll go ahead and just jump in. Hamilton, in his commentary, gives a chiastic structure to the psalm. So verses 1 and 2 are a plea, and that is mirrored by verse 17, which is praise. Verses 3 through 5, the innocent, are paralleled by verses 14 through 16, the guilty. In the verses 6 through 8, Rise Up, O Yahweh, is mirrored by verses 11 through 13, where God is a just judge. And that puts at the center verses 9 and 10, the desire for justice. And you could potentially combine this entire middle section together concerning the justice of God. But we're going to discuss the structure in some detail below. But moving on, Psalm 7 continues the practice of linking to the Psalms around it. Psalms 7 and 6 are linked by the theme of Yahweh's anger. In Psalm 6, verse 1, it's against the psalmist, and 7:6 against the psalmist's enemies. There's also themes of death, and both contain allusions to the concept found in Jeremiah that the Lord tests the heart and the mind. And Psalm 7 also continues the alternating morning-evening setting. So we've observed this through these psalms so far, that starting at Psalm 3, you have morning alternating to evening in Psalm 4, and then it goes back and forth. And so Psalm 7 is another morning psalm. But now one of the big items of interest in this psalm that I want to look at is the overall structure of it. It's very interesting. So the psalm is strongly bifurcated. It's divided in two. So much so that some commentators have argued the psalm was originally 2 separate compositions. The first section ends at verse 8a. As strong as the bifurcation appears, there is an overall structural integrity binding the entire psalm. The psalm is 131 words, excluding the header and selah. The mathematical center of the psalm are the 11 words located in verses 8b through 9a and b. This center itself contains its own center. The word translated come to an end. So the center of the psalm reads, Judge me, O Lord, according to my righteousness, and according to the integrity that is in me. O let the evil of the wicked come to an end, and may you establish the righteous. And interestingly enough, that's a really good summary of the entire psalm, which is something that we found is very often the center of the psalm numerically often contains the themes of the entire psalm. And that's not surprising. You get this a lot in ancient literature. The divine name Yahweh occurs 7 times in the poem. The middle usage occurs precisely at the seam of verse 8a. And Caspar Labuschagne identified 3 numeric chiasms structuring Psalm 7, 2 in the first section of the poem. But for our purposes here, we will only focus on the one encompassing the entire psalm. Labuschagne writes, the unity of the poem as a whole is significantly underscored by a numerical chiasmus, which binds 2 parts of the text together. Verses 1 through 9, with their 76 words addressed to God, including the 3 words spoken about God in verse 8a, and verses 10 through 17, with their 55 words spoken about God. So I have this table here for us. And verses 1 through 9, again, mostly in the second person, are 76 words. Verses 10 through 17, words spoken about God, 55 words. In total, we get 131. Now, we're going to return to this table, but first we need a brief sidebar on the atnach. So to understand the significance of the table above, we need to understand the atnach. The atnach was among the accent markings placed in the Hebrew text for the purposes of recitation. The atnach functions similar to the English comma or colon or semicolon. These markings and text divisions were not original to the Hebrew text. However, the symmetry created by these markings raises an important question. Were the scribes who added them creating a rhythmic structure to the poem, or were they discovering a rhythm that already existed? Given the rest of the witness of Scripture, that the Psalms were set to music and the Psalter was essentially the liturgical handbook of the people of God, I'm inclined to believe it's the latter. And so the point is that at some point later, the Masoretes or whoever put in these markings telling the reader when to pause during recitation. And in previous videos, we've already noted that there's some interesting things happening if you pay attention to the structuring with regards to the atnach, to these pauses, to this rhythm. And I don't think it's coincidental that the Psalms were set to music. And the Psalms go back to David, the founder of the worship in the temple, according to Chronicles. He created the instruments for worship, 2 Chronicles 7:6, 2 Chronicles 29, 1 Chronicles 23 through 27. He had a big part in this, including the prophets as well. So there's a strong link between prophecy and worship and the Psalms, the music set to the Psalms and things like that. So the fact that interesting number patterns are appearing in the Psalter, I don't think should surprise us. I mean, music basically is math. And it's something that I've not seen considered at all in discussions of the Psalms. But now I'm only on Psalm 7, but so far the work of Labuschagne has really made me question whether things like this are very important and evidence of exactly what the text actually says, that the Psalter, the Psalms, were musical compositions. And so now returning to the table that we looked at above, as the table indicates, the 76 and 55 words, remember 131 total, but separated into two parts, 76 and 55, those numbers are also arrived at by attention to the atnach. By way of example, verse 1 contains 8 words total, 4 words before and 4 words after the atnach. Verse 2 is 7 words total, 4 words before and 3 words after the atnach. So columns 3 and 4 are the totals if we continued counting the rest of the psalm this way. Notice the symmetry of the total of words after the atnach in verses 1 through 9 and the words before the atnach in verses 10 through 17. They're both 27. And this is part of that numerical chiasm that Labuschagne was talking about. Now, especially note the totals. 76 words before and 55 words after the atnach are precisely the total number of words in the two sections. And so as we noted above, the psalm is 131 words total. 76 words in one section, 55 in the other, roughly divided by words spoken to God, words spoken about God. But those same number divisions, 76 and 55, are represented by the words before and after the atnach. I don't think that's coincidental, especially given there are 2 more examples of the numerical chiasm in this same psalm. We only looked at the one that encompasses the entire psalm, but it happens 2 times in part 1. And in previous psalms, we've noted some interesting things happening in the word totals before and after the atnach. So the symmetry that things like this create, I don't think is accidental. I think it's evidence of a highly stylized composition. And the reason why it's so mathematically symmetrical and consistent is because it was set to music at some point. And so I think we're seeing the remnants of that. And we'll just go ahead and quickly look at Labuschagne's observation of divine number values, 17 and 26. Of course, the value of the divine name Yahweh, as well as kavod, glory, which we'll actually get to when we get to the psalm. But I'm just going to read these out for us. I'm sure some of these are coincidental, but just for the sake of completion, verses 3 through 5 are 26 words in total. Verses 4 and 5, 17 words total. Verses 1 through 5, 17 words after the atnach. Verses 1 through 6 are 51 words total, which is 3 times 17. Verses 3 through 7, 17 words after the atnach. Verses 9 and 10 are 17 words total. Verses 9 through 13 are 39 words. Now, this one's interesting because we have 26 before and 13 after the atnach. And as Labuschagne points out, this is Yahweh Echad, which is one. Echad is the term for one. So think of like the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4, the Lord our God. Yahweh, our Elohim, Yahweh is Echad. Yahweh is one. And so the number value of Echad, one, is 13. And so whenever you see 39 pop up, structuring something, and it's divided by 26 and 13, it's evidence that you're dealing here with this Yahweh Ahad formula. But verses 12 through 16 are 17 words after the atnach, and verses 13 through 17 are 34 total words, which is 2 times 17. Like I said, some are probably coincidental, or maybe coincidental, but there's quite a bit there that to hand wave it all is, I think, going too far in the other direction. But now to the psalm proper. The heading, as we've noted throughout this series so far, the headings are very interesting and kind of important. And so it reads, a shigeon of David, which he's saying to the Lord concerning the words of Cush, a Benjaminite. Now, nobody knows what to do with that in Hebrew, but fortunately, the Greek does something that's noteworthy. So they translated Cush to Hushai, the man David sent to advise Absalom. And so this is recalling the episode in 2 Samuel 17. We talked about this in the Psalm 3 video because that was the one that had a historical heading. And it's specifically this, when David fled Absalom. And so there were some thematic links back to that episode. Well, here I think we have some more, one by way of the heading, but also in some vocabulary. So as I point out here, in Hushai's speech, he counsels Absalom that even the valiant man whose heart is like the heart of a lion will utterly melt with fear. And that's 2 Samuel 17:10, and this is at the hands of David and his men. So basically he's telling him, don't go to battle with him. You run the risk of losing and losing the confidence of your people. But this might mirror Psalm 7:2, lest like a lion they tear my soul apart. And so the enemies of David are being compared to lions. Additionally, 2 Samuel 17:14 reads, for the Lord had ordained or appointed to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. And this term here is often translated as something like calamity, sometimes evil, things like that. And this connects well with verses 6 and 9 of the psalm. So verse 6, arise, O Lord, so on and so forth. You have appointed a judgment. It's that same term, ordained. Oh, let the evil of the wicked come to an end. Again, this is that same term that we saw up there for harm, ra. And may you establish the righteous. So there's very good reason to continue this historical setting that went all the way back to Psalm 3. And so there's strong links binding these psalms all together after the introduction of Psalms 1 and 2. In verse 1, O Lord my God, in you do I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers and deliver me. Verse 1 picks up the language of refuge, first employed in Psalm 2:12, where all are blessed who take refuge in him. Elsewhere in the Psalter, such as our verse here, as well as 5:11, the faithful take refuge in Yahweh. A tension is felt by the fact that him in Psalm 2 is a reference to the son of the Davidic king. How are we to take refuge in anything or anyone other than God? How can mankind take refuge in man? Of course, this riddle is solved by the divine Messiah, the man Jesus Christ, in whom we take refuge. And so we saw that in Psalm 2, that there's a lot of this blurring between God and the anointed son of David in Psalm 2, which of course makes sense in a messianic sense. So taking refuge in the Messiah is to take refuge in the Lord. Moving to verse 2, lest like a lion they tear my soul apart, rending it in pieces with none to deliver. We already looked at the connection with Samuel, but Augustine and Chrysostom saw the lion here as Satan. Augustine in particular took advantage of the Greek rendering the lion in the singular, lest he snatch my soul like a lion. In verses 3 and following, which is really another item of interest that I wanted to look at, it reads, O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there is wrong in my hands, if I have repaid my friend with evil, and that's the same term, ra, or plundered my enemy without cause, let the enemy pursue my soul and overtake it, and let him trample my life to the ground and lay my glory in the dust. Salah. And so as I write here, the Hebrew term glory is scattered 4 times in the first 8 Psalms. We're told in 3:3 that Yahweh is the glory and the lifter of my head. If we allow the Psalms to be interconnected and self-referential, then David's glory is not his own. David's glory is Yahweh. In 4:2, David asks, how long will his glory be turned into shame? This is sometimes translated honor, but it's the term kavod. Once again, the psalmist is not concerned with his own personal glory, but the glory of Yahweh. Verse 5 reaches a low point, literally, as his glory is laid in the dust. The term dust is as far-reaching as Genesis 2:7, 3:14, and 3:19. And these references are very interesting. Man is made of the dust, 2:7, which he returns to at death. That's 3:19. The serpent is cursed to eat the dust in 3:14. The dust language returns in the Messianic Psalm 22. Verse 15 states, "You lay me in the dust of death." By means of these intertextual connections, could verse 5 be echoing back to the proto-evangelium and connecting with the psalm that foretells the crucifixion? And because of the language of verse 6, I think the answer to that is yes. And I'm not alone in going in that direction, because beginning at verse 6, especially in Greek, the arise language is one of our New Testament resurrection terms. So you have the glory, which is actually God for David. The glory is being laid in the dust. And then we get to verse 6, arise, resurrect, O Lord, in your anger. Lift yourself up against the fury of my enemies. Awake for me. You have appointed a judgment. Let the assembly of the peoples be gathered about you. Over it, return on high. And I don't think I'm going too far out on the limb here, because the early church saw it this way. Now, they didn't connect some of the dust language, but they certainly did see it just broadly speaking that way. So Gregory of Nyssa, in his treatise on the inscriptions, 125 specifically, he says, "For the massive adversaries cannot otherwise be destroyed if the Lord has not risen on our behalf. And death must by all means precede the resurrection." So if I can restate this, verse 5 must by all means precede verse 6. So you have to die in order to resurrect. He then who has revealed the resurrection of the Lord has, at the same time, shown that which is bound up together with the resurrection. I mean, of course, the mystery related to the passion. For this reason, having been inspired by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, he says, "Rise up, O Lord, in your anger. Be exalted in the ends of my enemies." And Jerome, likewise, says, "Arise in order that a vast multitude may believe in you. For after you have risen, what else would we pray for? Return to the Father. Above them on high be enthroned. For whose sake? For the assembly of the peoples. In that you suffered for us. In that you rose again, you rose for us. In that you ascended to the Father, you ascend for us. Above them on high be enthroned. And no one has ascended into heaven except him who has descended from heaven, the Son of Man who is in heaven." And so it really does seem as if there is this tight connection between verses 5 and 6 in the kind of a death and resurrection motif. And Hamilton is pointing out some nice connections here, but I'm just going to skip down to this portion here, in the sense that he is connecting the congregation language, going all the way back to Psalm 2 and Psalm 1 as well, which have this kind of language, as well as the judgment mentioned in 1:5. Psalm 1:6 asserts that Yahweh knows the way of the righteous. And so it's in this that David is confident and invites the Lord to judge him. But we talked about that in the Psalm 1 and 2 video, that there is this heavily eschatological feel, especially to Psalm 1. It has this very interesting language in it. And you also have that Greek resurrection New Testament language in it as well. But you have the ungodly being judged. In fact, it says that the ungodly will not stand up. Again, that resurrection language. They will not stand up in the judgment. So it has this feeling of the eschaton. They're instead like chaff, which the wind drives away and things like that. So I think this being a very veiled, cryptic foreshadowing of the crucifixion and resurrection is not out of line. It's directly in line with all the themes that have been set up since Psalm 1 and 2. And continuing with some of this language here, Longman in his commentary, I want to hit the second quotation. He says, in response to his enemy's assault and his own innocence, the psalmist calls on God to arise in his anger. The call for God to arise, marks this psalm as a pre-battle song. And he lists a number of psalms in that theme. The third colon of parallelism of verse 6 varies the call by beseeching God to awake. The metaphor of God asleep indicates the psalmist's belief that God has been unresponsive and needs to be prodded into action. The unchallenged evil actions of his enemies are evidence of God's lack of attention. Now, this here is, I think, a questionable interpretation. I think Bernard Badeau offers a very strong counter interpretation to this kind of language. I did a video on an article he wrote. The video is called Jesus Slept. And what he goes into is this sleeping God motif. And of course, the video, as well as the article, he connects this to the New Testament, to specifically an episode where Jesus is asleep and, the disciples are calling on him to save them. But what you find is this is common everywhere, especially in relation to usually the combat myth kind of motif. So you have a God who is the high God. He's the God of gods by virtue of being the victor, being the divine warrior, that kind of thing. And the gods in general are supposed to be at rest, at leisure. And you get this in pagan religions. This is why humanity is created. They're created to be slaves so that the gods can just lounge around all day so that they can rest. Of course, the Bible is very different in that humanity is created to join into that rest, into that Sabbath rest. But what's interesting is what Badeau observes is that if the gods are supposed to be at rest, then the high God is often described of in ways of preeminent rest. He gets better rest than everybody else. He actually sleeps. So what you find is when you have language speaking of God sleeping, and that contradicts flatly other statements that the Lord never sleeps or slumbers and stuff like that, it's actually just the other side of the same metaphor, the metaphor of God's sovereignty. The Lord never sleeping or slumbering, He's always observing, His eyes are everywhere. That's symbolic of God being vigilant, observant, being sovereign, being ready to act, things like that. But the sleeping metaphor is also an appeal to God's sovereignty. It's saying you are the God of gods because you actually can rest. And so that's what needs to be understood when people like the psalmist ask God to arise or to awake. They're acknowledging He actually is the God of gods. It's not some extreme anthropomorphism. It's actually it's a symbol of God's ultimate sovereignty. So I would encourage you to check out that article as well as the video where I basically read through the article. But we will move on. And while I would love to go through the entirety of the psalm, for the sake of time, I'm actually just going to scrub through to some of the things I find especially noteworthy. And so commenting on verses 12 through 16, roughly thereabouts, Longman writes, the Christian too is engaged in a battle, not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Ephesians 6:12. The Christian now prays Psalm 7 with this battle in mind, knowing that Jesus contends on their behalf. The Christian also knows that Jesus will come again for a final battle, and thus the psalm can take on an eschatological dimension as his people await his return as a warrior to render final judgment against all human and spiritual enemies. Revelation 19. And the Blackwell commentary points out that there's a pun in the phrase fall and make. They fall into the hole that they have made, which cannot be rendered in English nor in Greek or Latin. So kind of worth knowing. There's a pun that's just very easy to read over in English. And Logman comments on verses 15 and 16 that these verses present a classic statement of retribution theology. And this is what we've been seeing over and over and over again in the Chronicles series, is this concept. The wicked are like those who dig a hole but fall into it themselves. They experience the violence that they have intended for others. Proverbs has a strong emphasis on the idea that pain rebounds on the heads of those who try to perpetrate it towards others. See Proverbs 1:18. While Job and Ecclesiastes teach that in this life, at least, retribution theology does not work perfectly, the psalmist and the sage in Proverbs point out that it is often the case. And this is a point that we've made a number of times in Chronicles, is that it takes this retribution theology, and I've compared it to Proverbs and the Psalms on some level, over against, again, Job, Ecclesiastes, stuff like that, where Chronicles takes this retribution theology. The good kings reign justly and they're orthodox in their worship, and that brings about prosperity and blessing. And then the bad kings plunge them into exile. They plunge them into catastrophes. Whereas if you read the king's account, as well as Samuel for that matter as well, it's much muddier than that, because humans are much more complex than that. We are a mixture of the good and the bad. But it's just worth thinking about because, like I said, if you follow along in Chronicles, we've hit this kind of motif over and over. And then the last verse, verse 17, I will give to the Lord the thanks due to his righteousness, and I will sing praise to the name of the Lord, the Most High. But we will close out with Hamilton. Now in verse 17, David says that he gives thanks to Yahweh and psalms the name of Yahweh, the Most High. The term rendered sing about is the verb form of the same word translated psalm. The verb zamar and the noun rendered psalm is mizmor. David is doing what this book, Psalms, is called. He is psalming Yahweh. And so that is a relatively brief look. I kind of wanted to talk about some of the structuring things as well as the death and resurrection motif in the middle of the psalm. And that's about all. I will see you guys next time.